Speaking of changing, how do you find the adaptation from going from fighter to coach? Do you find that when you're coaching a guy, do you try and coach them to your strengths, or in some ways I've heard people criticize coaches in a way that say they're trying to teach me to fight like how they fight? But how do you find the transition from fighter to coach?
Yeah, absolutely not. So, as much as I talk about how, I'm a street kid and all that stuff, or I was. Anyways, I got really interested in 2008 studying the brain. So, and how the brain works. And I started doing that originally out of fear because a lot of my buddies that were boxers were all punchy. And, and at that point, I'd been fighting for, like probably 14 years or 15 years as a professional, and had over, at that point, maybe like 190 or 180 fights with boxing, MMA, kickboxing, amateur pro, all that stuff. So I didn't want that to happen to me. So I started studying the brain and how the brain concussions and how your neurocortex is responsible for your cognitive thinking and your frontal lobe, your cognitive thinking and your emotional well-being and stuff like that. So when I started doing that, I started doing like preventative stuff to keep my brain sharp. Trust me, I'll tie this all into coaching. To keep my brain sharp. So I started doing things like neuroprogramming. And by doing neuroprogramming and kept getting involved in the brain, I started studying neurolinguistics. So when I started reading books on neurolinguistics, that made things pop into my head like, oh my God, I can train myself to think this way, but I can also train other people more efficiently. So the idea is, when you're training somebody, depending on what kind of moves they are, right? So if it's knees and elbows, those are what we refer to as gross motor skill. If it's things having to do with maybe specific types of punches and stuff, you're talking sometimes, especially with footwork, you're talking complex motor skill. So those things are going to be put into your brain, or as they call like your neural net, in a different way. So I started studying a way to coach people and try to bypass as fast as possible that constant cognitive thinking of flipping through the Rolodex to remember technique or whatever, and try to bypass that and go to your reactionary brain, like through your limbic system and stuff like that, to implant information faster. So, there's a couple of, guys out there that said, if you know nothing and you're starting from scratch, you could take like 10,000 hours or 10,000 repetitions in order to implant information, which is all horse crap. When in like what I do, or how I figured out how to do things. So when I train people, I absolutely don't train them anything like me. So a perfect example of this would be when I started with Tim Boetsch. So Tim Boetsch called me and said, hey, man, I know you're retired, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind coaching me much. So here's the thing is, like, he and I were friends before, right before he got in the UFC. And then he knew what kind of, like, where my thoughts were and what my thoughts were on training. And I took him to Sityo Tong, and we've been around each other and for a few years. And we clicked real well. And I said, yeah, you know what? Why don't you, come back to Maine for a little bit, and we'll work for a little bit and see what you think. See if we match up well. So he came in, and with this night in particular, he had some sparring. So I had like 6 of my guys waiting to shark him, and he goes out and he starts sparring. The first round starts. And he's like dancing around, and he's flicking a jab out, and he's, and I'm watching him, and like maybe a minute and a half in, I screamed at him. I go, who are you? And he looked at me and he goes, what? And I go, who are you, man? I don't even recognize you. And he's like, what do you mean? And I said, you're friggin', dancing around out here. You're flicking a jab. You're taking your time. Like, that's not you, man. You're not me. You're not a guy that's going to slowly dismantle or take a guy apart. You're not a guy that's going to be using footwork to just create angles and be a counter puncher, because that's another thing I was. You're a killer. So I know you like these guys, but they know who you are. They know what your style is. Style ain't my style. It's Tim Boetsch style. So Tim Boetsch style, the style that I know, is a guy who bites down on his mouthpiece, comes forward and scares the shit out of people, and throws heavy shots, and and will wrestle and just beat guys to a pulp. I said, so stop dancing around and flicking your jab and get out there and hurt some people. So, he went out there, and, by the end of that night, he was just smashing and twisting guys up and throwing guys on their heads. And afterwards he said, it was one of the best sparring sessions he'd had in a long time. And, shortly after that, he said to me that this is the first time he felt like he was him, because everybody else wanted to change him. And I said, well, here's the idea here is it's better to, like Cus D'Amato used to say, discover and uncover. So I would rather discover something that you do well, or uncover something that maybe you don't even know yet, and add to that, but add to it, make it stronger, faster, better, but add to it too, because it might be something that makes sense. So we have conversations where I say, check this out, and I'll do something or work with him, and I'll say, what do you think? And if he says, it doesn't click, then we go on. Then he'll go, okay, wait a minute, I like that one. So we I'm not the coach, and I don't say it's my way. It's really up to the person that you're training, because if they don't believe in you, if they don't believe in you as a coach, if they don't believe in the techniques that you're teaching them, the tactics, it doesn't work. It's not going to work, because when it comes time to fight time, you're always going to go back to what you do, what you feel most comfortable with. And if you don't feel comfortable with the coaches and people that you're with, you're never going to perform. And and again, a lot of stuff that ties into the brain and the way that I try to teach. But with that said, I would rather embrace the individual. There are things that they do, and I might see it, and this is the way they do it. And I just, I look at them, like, especially the guys that have been fighting for a long time. They've got their sword, so I just want to keep sharpening that sword. So sharpen the sword, go into battle with the sword that they've been using, because I don't want to give them another sword. You give them another sword, they might not feel comfortable with it. It might not make sense to them. But if I can do that and maybe throw in a couple of tactics while they use their weapon, that's going to be that's a winning formula, I believe.
Speaking of Tim Boetsch, he has a big fight coming up against Johny Hendricks. Has fight camp started yet, or when does it start? And how do you see that going for Tim? Do you think that's a good matchup for him?
Well, he's basically right now, he's just kind of keeping himself in decent shape. I think we're like 14 weeks out, or maybe a little longer. I think we're about 14 weeks. But he'll be here with me come the beginning of May, and we'll start the real camp and really starting to push things then. And I think that it's a great fight for Tim. Not a good fight for Hendricks, in that you have two guys that are wrestlers, two guys that are known to be big punchers. But as far as I can remember, and I've gone through a lot of Hendricks fights too, because when I found out, I started watching stuff. The only one that I can remember that was like real big, real huge, was the knockout that he did on, was it John Fitch?
Yeah.
Like when he walked out and he just smashed John Fitch. But ever since then, he's just really, thumped people up and, definitely out-wrestled and beat him up a little bit. But Tim's a different beast. Johny Hendricks is a guy that's couldn't make 170 anymore and went to 85. Tim Boetsch is a guy that was a heavyweight fighter, won some heavyweight titles in some smaller organizations. then decided when he got to the UFC he was going to go to light heavy, competed at light heavy for a while, and then was able to figure out how to make 185. So, and every time Tim gets back into the cage, we shoot for 208. So he'll be 185 at weigh-ins or 186, and he'll be 208 when they fight. And I don't think, Hendricks will be like that. So, because I'm, I back and forth from like 210 to 205. And even when Tim gets to like 186, he still looks physically bigger than me. He just looks like a big gorilla. And so he puts all that weight, he takes it off and puts it on really fast. And it doesn't affect him as long as I say, as long as he doesn't go over 208, because then he can get a little sluggish and it can slow you down. But that's our number. So if he stays between that, he'll be good.
There's been a lot of discussion about weight cutting lately in MMA. Does Tim have trouble making that weight, or does he make it perfectly fine, no health issues at all?
Yeah, no, he makes it fine. It's I'm gonna say it's a tough. I don't even know if I should say it's a tough weight cut. It's not. It's a pretty normal weight cut to me. I've done tough weight cuts, so I would say, me making 55, I dropped, I had to do, the most I ever did, I cut 52 pounds in 10 weeks. But I cut 23 pounds in 11 hours. So those are real serious weight cuts. So that's a lot different. So Tim, you typically, the day of the weigh-in, we wake up and he literally has like maybe 5 pounds left to go. So, he does a good job. He's a professional. He does a really good job. And we do it safe too. We know how to do it differently than a lot of other people do.